C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, Men Without Chests, deals with the present. Part 2, The Way, deals with the past. Part 3, The Abolition of Man, deals with the future. And the appendix contains examples of what Lewis calls the Tao. In Part 1, we established what Lewis meant by the Tao. He co-opted the term to stand for the world of traditional moral values universal to all major cultures, as opposed to the world of moral relativism or ethical subjectivism in modern philosophy. He spends most of Part 2 brutally hacking away at every conceivable alternative system of values. He shows that under the procedure used to debunk the Tao, all these other systems can also be debunked. That this process of debunking the Tao ultimately debunks itself. The main objections covered are progressivism, utilitarianism, and instinct-based ethics. He opens by pointing out that people who object to the Tao almost always have some value system of their own that they are trying to substitute for it. But all of these systems fall apart on examination, for unless they admit that certain things really are intrinsically good in themselves, as the traditionalists maintain, they ultimately fail to adequately define the summum bonum, greatest good or ultimate end. They have some arbitrary goal in mind that they regard as more necessary or progressive or efficient. But they cannot adequately answer the questions, necessary for what? Progressing toward what? Affecting what? And why the goals given in those answers are desirable, and why those desires are desirable ad infinitum. The Tao maintains that certain states of affairs are in and of themselves intrinsically meritorious, and so doesn't fall prey to the error of an infinite regress of justifications. The traditional moral teachers agree with the utilitarian that self-sacrifice is sometimes required for the good of all. Ayn Rand hated this part. But why should we, personally, be the ones selected out of the group to make the necessary sacrifice or take the necessary risk? If there is nothing intrinsically noble, such as found in the Tao, we can always invent excuses and arguments to push the responsibility onto someone else. Utilitarianism fails because it is a wholly social ethic that lacks the essential component of personal obligation. Instinct-based ethics means the idea that our moral values are derived simply from our animal instincts. Do our animal instincts make our morality? This idea would suggest that our moral principles or inherited taboos are simply a rationalization of our herd instinct evolved as a survival mechanism for social animals. So it's not intrinsically wrong to randomly stab other people in the face for no reason, but only wrong because we have an instinct that tells us not to do it. But here's the problem. Ethics is not about telling us what we actually in fact do. That would be the job of behavioral psychology and philosophical anthropology. Ethics is about telling us what we ought to do, what we should do, should have done, ought to have done, and ought to be doing. Basing our ethics on instinct doesn't make sense because telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people in general. People say different things. So do instincts. There is no single monolithic instinct that we must obey. Our instincts are at war with one another. There isn't a single one of our instinctive impulses which would not claim to be gratified at the expense of all the rest. Any one of our instincts, if made master and ruler over all the others, would make us all into devils and tyrants. In reality, we find we must control and even suppress each of our instincts at certain times and encourage them at other times. We must control and suppress our fighting instinct when someone has said something that makes us angry to avoid hitting them. But we must encourage our fighting instinct when we are in military combat and are in need of courage to win a battle. We must encourage our parental instincts when we have a baby to take care of, and suppress them when the child is grown and needs to become independent. In the case of each instinct, there are times to encourage it and times to suppress it, and we cannot appeal to our instincts to tell us which instinct we ought to obey. They will all clamor for us to pursue mutually contradictory courses of action. Can these objectors maintain that there is an instinct of a higher order directing us in which instincts to obey, and yet another higher one directing us to obey it, and so on to infinity? This is absurd, impossible, and bears no relation to our actual moral experience. An analogy is given that our instincts are like the keys on a piano. Musicians know that pianos don't come with two kinds of notes, being the right notes and the wrong notes. Every note on the piano is right at certain times and wrong at certain other times. Ethical systems are meant to give us a tune to play on the keys of instinct. They must provide us with a separate thing that is not itself an instinct, which enables us to know which instincts to encourage and which to discourage in different situations. A sheet of music which tells us which keys to press in what order cannot itself be one of the keys. Ethics cannot be derived from instinct. Every attempt to do so conceals a judgment which is passed upon our instincts and is not derivable from them. Lewis concludes that the Tao is the sole source of all value judgments, by showing that all attempts to attack the Tao in deference to some other system of value judgments depend on the Tao for such validity as they possess. He doesn't say it directly, but it's 1943, and he's addressing Nazism as a prime example of this fallacy. He expands on this philosophy in The Great Divorce, among other places, asserting that nothing is intrinsically, ontologically evil, but that all evil comes from something good that has been spoiled, twisted, or corrupted somehow. There's one more important point in here that we've got to cover, and that's Lewis's answer to the question of how there could be any moral progress if traditional moral values, what he calls the world of the Tao, are timeless, constant, and unchanging. He distinguishes between two different types of change, writing, "There is a difference between a real moral advance and a mere innovation. From the Confucian, 'Do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you,' to the Christian, 'Do as you would be done by,' is a real advance. The morality of Nietzsche is a mere innovation. The first is an advance, because no one who did not admit the validity of the old maxim could see reason for accepting the new one, and anyone who accepted the old would at once recognize the new as an extension of the same principle. If he rejected it, he would have to reject it as a superfluity, something that went too far, not as something simply heterogeneous from his own ideas of value. But the Nietzschean ethic can be accepted only if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error, and then to put ourselves in a position where we can find no ground for any value judgments at all. It's the difference between a man who says to us, "You like your vegetables moderately fresh. Why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh?" and a man who says to us, "Throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead." So, going from the Confucian ethic of leaving other people alone to the Christian ethic of the Golden Rule is a real moral advance according to Lewis. Is going from Jesus' Golden Rule to Kant's categorical imperative an example of a real moral advance or a mere innovation? That's left up to the reader to figure out. Lewis describes the sort of objectors covered here in Part 2 as half-hearted skeptics who still hope to find real values when they have debunked the traditional ones. I think Jean-Paul Sartre would have agreed with that description. Part 3 will address the much more seriously dangerous, tough-minded philosophies that are prepared to accept the judgment of Part 2 that all systems of value fail when their roots in the Tao are cut, and consequently reject all systems of value.